When we imagine ancient Rome, we picture the Colosseum's blood-soaked sand, the Forum's marble columns gleaming under the Italian sun, the Senate's echoing debates that decided the fate of continents. We think of legions marching in perfect formation, aqueducts spanning valleys like stone rainbows, emperors draped in purple addressing crowds from gilded balconies. We imagine grandeur, power, civilization at its peak. We do not imagine toilets. And yet, if you truly want to understand Rome, not the myth, not the propaganda carved into triumphal arches, but the actual living, breathing, sweating, arguing city, you must understand its toilets. Because Rome's public latrines were everywhere, not hidden away in back alleys or confined to the homes of the wealthy, everywhere. Integrated into the fabric of urban life like temples, baths, and markets. They were as fundamental to Roman civilization as roads and legions, and far more revealing about what it meant to live in the world's first true megacity.
By the height of the empire, Rome's population had swelled to over 1 million people, possibly more. No one could count them all. Slaves, migrants, merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean, soldiers on leave, freedmen scrambling for status, senators maintaining multiple households, entire families crammed into insular apartments stacked 5 or 6 stories high. The city was suffocating under its own success. Housing was vertical, cramped, and constructed from wood and brick that caught fire with terrifying regularity. Space was the ultimate luxury, and most Romans had none. This density created a problem that no amount of military genius or architectural ambition could solve with elegance. Where do 1 million people relieve themselves? Private toilets were rare. Only the wealthiest patrician families could afford homes with private latrines connected to sewers. For everyone else, the overwhelming majority, bodily functions were a public affair. The state responded with characteristic Roman pragmatism. It built public latrines, dozens of them, perhaps over 100 by the 2nd century AD. They were scattered throughout the city, positioned near baths, markets, theaters, and major intersections. Some were standalone structures, others were integrated into bath complexes or attached to public buildings. They became as common as fountains, as unremarkable as benches. But there was nothing simple about their engineering.
Roman latrines were marvels of urban infrastructure, though they would never inspire poets the way aqueducts did. They relied on a continuous flow of water, fresh water channeled in from the aqueducts, running beneath the stone benches and flushing waste into the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer, which drained into the Tiber. The system was ingenious. Gravity did most of the work, water moved constantly, and the smell, while never pleasant, was mitigated by the current. Beneath the benches, water flowed in shallow channels, carrying everything away. Some latrines even featured decorative mosaics on the floors, dolphins and sea creatures rendered in tiny tiles, a strange touch of beauty in a decidedly unbeautiful space. The seating arrangements were communal. Stone or marble benches lined the walls, punctuated by keyhole-shaped openings. No partitions, no doors, no privacy whatsoever. You sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers, your knees nearly touching the knees of the man across from you. In the largest latrines, 20 or 30 people might be seated simultaneously, all facing inward, all visible to one another. The Romans did not see this as a problem. Privacy, as a concept, barely existed in their world. Bathing was communal. Sleeping often was too, especially for the poor. Why should relieving oneself be any different? They talked. That was the point. Latrines were not merely functional, they were social. Men conducted business there, catching neighbors and clients in a moment of vulnerability and candor. Merchants negotiated contracts while seated side by side. Soldiers traded rumors about campaigns. Freedmen boasted about their patrons. Slaves exchanged gossip about their masters. The latrine was a leveling space where a senator might find himself sitting next to a dock worker, where pretense was difficult to maintain when everyone was literally in the same position.
This was Rome's accidental genius. It created a space where the rigid social hierarchy softened, just slightly, just long enough for information to flow freely. The latrine became a hub of communication, a place where news spread faster than anywhere except the forum. Political rumors were born there. Scandals were whispered there. Insults were traded there. Deals were struck there. The latrine was, in a very real sense, ancient Rome's social media, a place where everyone gathered, where information circulated wildly, where tempers flared, where reputations were made and destroyed. And like social media, it was a perfect environment for chaos. The psychological setup was combustible. Take a densely packed, highly stratified society. Add urban stress, competition for status, and economic anxiety. Now place people in a cramped, intimate space where they are physically vulnerable, exposed, unable to leave quickly. Mix in alcohol. Many men went to latrines directly after visiting taverns. Add the constant presence of insults, whether spoken aloud or scrawled into the walls as graffiti. Season with theft, as opportunists waited for distracted victims to leave their sandals or cloaks unguarded. Throw in territorial disputes over preferred seats, hygienic disagreements over shared cleaning tools, and the ever-present possibility of humiliation. You have created, entirely by accident, a pressure cooker.
If you wanted to know what Rome was really thinking, not what the Senate was debating or what the emperor's propagandists were carving into stone, but what ordinary people believed, feared, and mocked, you went to the latrines. They were the city's unofficial news network. While the wealthy received reports from clients and relied on couriers, the average Roman got his information from the street. And the latrine was the most reliable street of all. Men arrived early in the morning, after the baths in the afternoon, before dinner in the evening. They sat, they talked, they listened. News circulated with the efficiency of a modern algorithm. A rumor whispered in the Suburra at dawn could reach the Aventine by noon, mutating slightly with each retelling, gaining details, losing context, becoming something entirely new. Political rumors thrived in latrines. Elections were discussed there, candidates were mocked there, bribes were rumored there. When an emperor fell ill, the latrines knew before the Senate did. When a general was recalled from the frontier, speculation began in the toilets. When a senator's wife was caught in scandal, every latrine in Rome had an opinion by nightfall. The conversations were blunt, cynical, and often obscene. Romans had no illusions about their leaders. They admired power, but they did not worship it. In the latrine, everyone was fair game.
The graffiti told its own story. Roman walls were covered in it. Insults, jokes, political slogans, crude drawings, declarations of love and hate. Latrines were prime real estate for this underground literature. Scratched into plaster or carved into stone, the messages ranged from the banal to the vicious. Marcus is a thief. Lucius owes me money. The baker's bread is garbage. Senator Gaius is a coward. Some graffiti was sexual, explicit, often illustrated. Some was political, mocking emperors by name, a dangerous act, though anonymity provided some protection. Some was philosophical, surprising bits of wisdom wedged between cruder sentiments. We are all slaves to fortune. Life is short, enjoy it. Death comes for everyone. The latrine was a democracy of insults. Slaves mocked masters. Freedmen ridiculed senators. Soldiers insulted civilians. And because everyone was sitting, exposed, and distracted, retaliation was difficult. A man could scratch an insult into the wall and be gone before the target even saw it. This anonymity emboldened people. It made the latrine a space of unchecked speech, where social norms bent under the weight of proximity and shared indignity. But not all communication was written. The verbal culture was intense. Romans were loud, argumentative, and proud. They loved debate, even when pointless. In the latrine, debates turned into shouting matches. A casual comment about grain prices could spiral into an hour-long argument about the emperor's policies. A complaint about a neighbor could escalate into a string of accusations, insults, and threats. The latrine loudmouths were a recognized type, men who came not to relieve themselves, but to hold court, to dominate conversations, to bully quieter patrons into silence or agreement. Some were genuinely informed. Most were simply confident. They spoke with authority about things they barely understood, and because they were loud and persistent, people listened.
Businessmen used latrines strategically. If you wanted to catch a rival off guard, you waited for him in the latrine. You sat nearby, made small talk, then pivoted to business. The setting created pressure. It was hard to be evasive when you were physically trapped. Deals were negotiated there, partnerships formed, grudges aired. Some merchants even scheduled latrine meetings, knowing that the informal setting would disarm opponents or encourage honesty. Others used the space for intimidation. You brought friends, surrounded a rival, and made your point while he was vulnerable. It wasn't violence, not yet, but it was psychological warfare. The class collision was unavoidable. In most Roman spaces, hierarchy was enforced. Slaves deferred to freedmen. Freedmen deferred to citizens. Citizens deferred to equestrians. Equestrians deferred to senators. But in the latrine, this order blurred. A slave might sit next to his master's business rival. A freedman might overhear a senator's private conversation. A soldier might insult a merchant without realizing he was wealthy. The latrine stripped away the visual markers of status, the toga, the jewelry, the entourage. Everyone was reduced to the same basic act, and in that reduction, resentments surfaced. Ego met humiliation there. This was the core tension. Romans were obsessed with honor, with dignitas, with maintaining face. But the latrine made dignity impossible. You were exposed. You were vulnerable. You smelled bad. And you were surrounded by strangers who felt the same way and resented you for reminding them of their own indignity. Insults in this context were not abstract. They were personal. A joke at your expense in the forum might be forgotten. A joke in the latrine while you sat exposed and powerless was an attack on your very identity.
This is why arguments in latrines were so volatile. They weren't really about the grain dole or the gladiator games or the emperor's foreign policy. They were about control, about asserting dominance in a space where everyone was equal and therefore desperate to prove they were not. A man insulted in the latrine had two choices: accept the humiliation or respond with force. Many chose force. The latrine was ancient Rome's social media. It was unfiltered, unregulated, chaotic, and deeply human. It spread information and misinformation with equal efficiency. It gave voice to the voiceless and megaphone to the obnoxious. It created conflict out of proximity and anonymity. It was where Rome talked to itself, complained to itself, mocked itself, and occasionally, violently turned on itself.
Every society has unwritten rules. Rome's latrines had dozens. The problem was that no one agreed on them. Take seating.
In theory, latrines operated on a first-come, first-served basis. In practice, regulars claimed territories. Certain seats were considered superior, closer to the water flow, farther from the entrance, positioned for optimal conversation or privacy. Men developed habits. They arrived at the same time each day, sat in the same spot, expected the same deference. When a stranger took their seat, tension erupted. These disputes started verbally. "That's my spot. I don't see your name on it. I've been sitting here for 10 years. I don't care." But words escalated quickly. A shove, a grab, a punch. The cramped space made violence almost inevitable. You couldn't walk away. You couldn't retreat. You were sitting, surrounded, hemmed in by stone and strangers. A fight in the latrine wasn't like a fight in the street. It was claustrophobic, desperate, and often ended only when one man was too injured to continue. Theft was a constant problem. Romans didn't wear much to the baths or latrines. A simple tunic, maybe a cloak, sandals. They left these items on hooks or benches while they sat. Opportunists watched. The moment you were distracted, your sandals vanished. Your cloak disappeared. Sometimes they waited until you were mid-act, knowing you couldn't chase them. Other times they worked in pairs. One distracted you with conversation, the other stole.
Getting robbed in a latrine was humiliating. You couldn't report it to the authorities without admitting where you were and what you were doing when it happened. You couldn't chase the thief without exposing yourself. So victims reacted with rage. They lashed out at anyone nearby. They accused random strangers. They started fights with people who had nothing to do with the theft simply because they needed to restore their sense of control. The communal sponge was another flashpoint. Romans didn't use toilet paper. They used a tersorium, a sponge on a stick, rinsed in the water channel after use. It was communal. Everyone used the same sponge. This was normal to them, unremarkable, except when it wasn't. Arguments over the sponge were surprisingly common. Who used it last? Who left it dirty? Who hogged it? Who contaminated it? Hygiene was a legitimate concern. Disease spread easily in crowded cities, and Romans understood, vaguely, that filth caused sickness. But sponge disputes were also about respect. If you used the sponge carelessly, you were disrespecting everyone else. If you refused to share it, you were acting superior. If you criticized someone's hygiene, you were calling them low class, dirty, unworthy. These insults stung. They led to shoving. Shoving led to punches. Punches led to injuries. Alcohol made everything worse. Many Romans went to latrines after visiting taverns. They were drunk, belligerent, and looking for confrontation. A drunk man in a latrine was unpredictable. He might start singing. He might start arguing. He might vomit. He might swing at someone for no reason. And because he was surrounded by other men, many of whom were also drunk or irritable, violence spread like fire. Youths turned latrine disruption into sport. Gangs of young men, often slaves or freedmen with too much time and too little supervision, deliberately provoked people. They insulted strangers. They blocked seats. They stole items and taunted victims. They urinated on people. This wasn't random. It was theater. They performed for each other, competed to see who could cause the most chaos, who could provoke the most dramatic reaction. For them, the latrine was entertainment. For their victims, it was a nightmare. Being humiliated in public in a space where you were vulnerable and exposed was psychologically devastating. Some men responded with violence. They attacked their tormentors, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Others sought revenge later, tracking down the youths and ambushing them. The cycle escalated.
And then there were the accidents. The sewer openings beneath the benches were not perfectly safe. If someone fell, pushed during a fight, or slipping on wet stone, they could tumble into the channel below. The water was shallow, but fast-moving. Drowning was rare, but possible. More common were injuries from hitting stone edges or being trampled by panicked crowds trying to pull someone out. At least one historical account mentions a man dying after being shoved into the sewer during a dispute, though details are scarce. What's clear is that by the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, latrine violence was a recognized problem. It wasn't an epidemic, but it was frequent enough to concern local magistrates. Fights were reported, injuries were documented, deaths, while rare, occurred. And the psychological impact was widespread. The latrine, which should have been mundane infrastructure, had become a space of genuine danger. The spark was always something small, a seat, a sponge, an insult, a stolen sandal. But the underlying cause was structural. Rome had packed too many people into too small a space and stripped away their privacy, dignity, and personal boundaries. It had created a system where strangers were forced into intimacy without trust, where insults and theft were easy, where retaliation was difficult but tempting, where ego and humiliation collided daily. The latrine didn't cause violence, Rome did. The latrine simply made it inevitable.
Violence in Rome's latrines was usually petty, a black eye, a split lip, a bruised ego. Most fights ended quickly, broken up by bystanders or resolved when one man yielded. But not always. Sometimes men died. Soldiers were the worst offenders. Rome's military culture glorified violence, aggression, and dominance. Soldiers were trained to kill, rewarded for brutality, and often stationed in cities where they had little to do and too much time to drink. They were arrogant, dismissive of civilians, and accustomed to taking what they wanted without consequence. When a soldier entered a latrine, he expected deference. If he didn't get it, he responded with force. There are scattered references in historical sources of soldiers killing civilians in latrines. The details are vague. Ancient historians rarely cared about individual murders of common people. But the pattern is clear. A soldier insults a merchant. The merchant responds. The soldier draws a knife. The merchant dies. Or a soldier demands a seat. An elderly man refuses. The soldier shoves him. The man cracks his skull on stone. Or a soldier gets drunk, picks a fight, and stabs someone over a perceived slight that no one else even noticed. These incidents rarely led to punishment. Soldiers were protected by their units, by their commanders, by the assumption that military men were above civilian law. If a victim's family complained, they were ignored or intimidated. If a magistrate tried to intervene, he risked angering the army, which no civilian official wanted to do. So, soldiers killed with impunity, and latrines became places where civilians avoided confrontation with anyone in military dress. Gladiators and bodyguards were similarly dangerous. Gladiators were celebrities, admired for their skill and ferocity, but also feared for their tempers. They were professional killers, after all, trained to maim and murder for entertainment. When they appeared in public, people cleared space. But in a latrine, space was limited. If a gladiator wanted a seat, you gave it to him. If you didn't, you risked violence from a man who had killed dozens of opponents in the arena. Bodyguards presented a related problem. Wealthy Romans employed guards, often ex-soldiers or former gladiators, to protect them in the dangerous streets. These men were loyal, brutal, and uninterested in fairness. If their employer was insulted in a latrine, they retaliated. If someone refused to yield a seat to their patron, they forced compliance. There are accounts of bodyguards beating men unconscious in latrines, sometimes on direct orders, sometimes simply because they enjoyed it. The hyper-masculine culture of Rome made these incidents almost inevitable. Honor was everything. Reputation was everything. A man who allowed himself to be insulted, who yielded without resistance, was a coward, and cowardice was worse than death. So men fought,
even when the stakes were trivial, even when they knew they would lose, because not fighting meant losing face forever. Pickpockets added another layer of danger. We've already discussed theft, but some thieves were armed. If caught or confronted, they didn't run, they stabbed. A man grabbing his stolen sandals might find a knife in his ribs. A crowd surrounding a thief might provoke him into slashing wildly, injuring bystanders. The cramped, chaotic environment of the latrine made it easy for thieves to escape or, if cornered, to fight their way out. The most calculated violence came from latrine ambushes. Criminals discovered that latrines were ideal places to trap victims. You waited for a target, someone wealthy, someone unpopular, someone who owed you money, and you followed them into the latrine. You positioned yourself strategically, brought allies if needed, and attacked when they were vulnerable. The victim couldn't run. The space was too confined for witnesses to intervene easily, and the general chaos of the latrine provided cover for the crime.
These ambushes weren't common, but they were known. Some were revenge killings, others were professional hits, assassinations carried out by hired thugs. A few were political, eliminating a rival, silencing a witness, sending a message. The latrine, which seemed too mundane to be dangerous, became a site of premeditated murder. Roman society was shocked by this, not because they were squeamish about violence. Public executions, gladiator games, and military conquests were celebrated, but because latrine murders violated an unspoken boundary. The latrine was civic infrastructure, a public good, a symbol of Roman civilization's superiority over barbarism. It was supposed to be safe, mundane, boring. The idea that people were being killed there, in a space that represented order and cleanliness, was psychologically disturbing. It revealed a truth that Rome didn't want to face. The city was barely controlled. The legions could conquer Gaul and Britannia, but they couldn't stop men from murdering each other in toilets. The aqueducts could bring water from mountains, but they couldn't prevent theft and violence in the spaces that water served. Rome's infrastructure was magnificent. Its social cohesion was fragile.
Latrine murders were rare enough that each one felt like an anomaly, but common enough that they became part of the city's background anxiety. People adjusted. They avoided certain latrines. They went in groups. They carried weapons. They learned to recognize dangerous types, drunk soldiers, aggressive gladiators, suspicious loiterers, and they kept their distance. But they couldn't avoid latrines entirely. Biology didn't allow it. So they went, and they hoped, and sometimes they became victims.
Rome didn't have a police force in the modern sense. For most of its history, law enforcement was informal, decentralized, and often ineffective. Magistrates had legal authority, but little manpower. The Praetorian Guard protected the emperor, not the streets. The vigiles fought fires and investigated arson, but they weren't primarily a police force. The average Roman had no one to call when a crime occurred. This changed slowly and partially during the reign of Augustus. Recognizing that the city's population growth and social tensions demanded some form of order, he created the cohortes urbanae, the urban cohorts. These were paramilitary units, organized like legions but tasked with internal security. They patrolled the streets, intervened in riots, arrested criminals, and provided a visible presence of state authority. By the 2nd century AD, there were several thousand urban cohort soldiers stationed in Rome. They were not loved. Romans resented being policed by soldiers. The urban cohorts were seen as enforcers of imperial will, extensions of the emperor's power into daily life. They were often brutal, quick to use violence, and susceptible to bribery. But they were also the only force capable of managing the city's chaos. And as latrine violence escalated, magistrates turned to the urban cohorts for help.
Patrols were established near public latrines in the busiest districts: Subura, the Aventine, the area around the Circus Maximus. Soldiers were stationed at major intersections and told to watch for disturbances. They didn't enter latrines routinely, that would have been impractical and invasive, but they responded to shouts, fights, and reports of violence. Their presence was meant to deter crime and reassure the public. It had mixed results. Some troublemakers were deterred. Others were emboldened, seeing the patrols as a challenge. Soldiers arrested men for fighting in latrines, but the legal process was slow and inconsistent. Fines were imposed for disturbing the peace, but they were rarely collected. Jail was an option, but Rome's prisons were temporary holding cells, not long-term facilities. Punishment usually meant corporal punishment, flogging, or for more serious crimes, exile or execution. But most latrine fights didn't warrant those extremes. Magistrates tried to impose order. Some issued edicts requiring queue systems, first come, first served, no exceptions. Others banned weapons from latrines, though enforcement was nearly impossible. A few attempted to regulate latrine hours, limiting access during peak times to reduce overcrowding. None of these measures worked. Romans ignored rules they found inconvenient, and the urban cohorts lacked the resources to enforce them consistently. Bribery undermined everything. Wealthy Romans, if caught or accused in latrine incidents, simply paid off the soldiers. A few coins, a promise of favor, and the matter disappeared. This infuriated poorer Romans, who saw the system as rigged. A slave or freedman caught fighting would be beaten or jailed. A senator's bodyguard, guilty of the same crime, would walk free. The inconsistency bred cynicism and resentment. The psychological absurdity was not lost on contemporary observers. Rome was an empire. It had conquered half the known world. Its legions had defeated Carthage, humbled Macedonia, subdued Gaul, and pushed into Germania and Britannia. Its engineers built aqueducts that defied gravity, roads that spanned continents, harbors that connected oceans. Its philosophers debated the nature of justice, virtue, and the soul. And yet, the capital city could not control its bathrooms. Satirists mocked this. Juvenal, Martial, and others wrote scathing critiques of Roman life, and latrines featured prominently. The image of soldiers patrolling toilets, of magistrates debating sponge etiquette, of the world's greatest empire defeated by petty violence in public restrooms, it was absurd, and everyone knew it. But the laughter was bitter, because the latrine problem was a symptom, not the disease. The real issue was Rome itself, a city too large, too unequal, too crowded, too proud to admit it was failing.
The urban cohorts did what they could. They broke up fights, they arrested repeat offenders, they provided a semblance of order, but they couldn't solve the underlying problem. They couldn't make the latrines less crowded. They couldn't eliminate poverty, resentment, or drunkenness. They couldn't change Roman culture, which glorified aggression and punished weakness. They were soldiers, not social workers, and the task they'd been given was impossible. So, latrine violence continued. It never reached epidemic levels. Most people used latrines daily without incident. But it remained a persistent, embarrassing reminder that civilization was thinner than Rome wanted to believe. The empire could project power across continents, but it couldn't keep its citizens from killing each other in toilets.
The toilet wars were never official. No historian recorded them under that name. No emperor issued edicts specifically about them. They were background noise, the kind of low-level urban dysfunction that every large city experiences, but rarely documents. And yet, they matter, because they reveal truths about Rome that monuments and inscriptions do not. Start with masculinity. Roman manhood was defined by dominance,
courage, and the refusal to tolerate disrespect. A man defended his honor, always, or he was not a man. This ethos worked well on battlefields. It produced disciplined soldiers and fearless generals. But in a crowded city, where men were constantly bumping into each other, where space and status were contested every day, this same ethos guaranteed conflict. The latrine was a microcosm of this tension. Every insult was a challenge. Every slight demanded response. Walking away meant cowardice. Fighting back meant violence. There was no middle ground. This hyper-masculine culture extended beyond latrines, of course. It shaped politics, where rivals destroyed each other ruthlessly. It shaped social life, where status was everything, and humiliation was intolerable. But the latrine concentrated it, made it visible, reduced it to its absurd essentials. Two men fighting over a toilet seat weren't defending the republic or family honor. They were just fighting, because that's what Roman men did.
Class tension was equally revealing. Rome was stratified, hierarchical, and deeply unequal. But it also required constant interaction between classes. Slaves served masters. Freedmen worked for patrons. Merchants dealt with senators. And in public spaces, especially latrines, these boundaries blurred. The latrine didn't erase class. Everyone knew who was wealthy, who was powerful. But it reduced the physical distance. A senator sat next to a dock worker. An equestrian shared a sponge with a slave. This proximity bred resentment on both sides. The powerful resented being treated as equals. The powerless resented being reminded of their inferiority. Violence was the inevitable result. Gossip culture tells us something else. Romans were obsessed with information. They traded rumors compulsively, not because they were uniquely nosy, but because information was power. Knowing who owed money, who was in favor, who was being prosecuted, this knowledge could be leveraged. The latrine was a marketplace for information, and participation was both voluntary and necessary. If you didn't listen, you missed opportunities. If you didn't speak, you were invisible. So people talked, shared, speculated, and sometimes lied. The line between news and misinformation was thin, and no one particularly cared. Humor writers understood all this. Juvenal satires drip with contempt for Roman society, and latrines appear repeatedly as symbols of degradation. Martial's epigrams mock individuals by name, often referencing their behavior in baths and latrines. These writers weren't inventing absurdity. They were documenting it. And their audiences laughed because they recognized the truth. The latrine was ridiculous. It was also unavoidable.
There's an unspoken rule among historians. You learn more about a society from its toilets than its temples. Temples show what people aspired to. Toilets show what they actually were. Rome aspired to order, justice, and glory. Its toilets revealed insecurity, pettiness, and violence. Both are true. Both are Rome. The final irony is archaeological. We have the toilets. Excavations across the former empire have uncovered dozens of public latrines, many remarkably intact. Stone benches, sewer channels, mosaics, graffiti, all preserved. We can walk through Ostia Antica and sit on the same benches Romans used 2,000 years ago. We can see the keyholes, trace the water flow, read the inscriptions. But the stories? Those survive only in fragments. A line in Juvenal, a complaint in a legal document, a reference in a letter. There's an unspoken rule among historians. You learn more about a society from its toilets than its temples. Temples show what people aspired to. Toilets show what they actually were. Rome aspired to order, justice, and glory. Its toilets revealed insecurity, pettiness, and violence. Both are true. Both are Rome. The final irony is archaeological. We have the toilets. Excavations across the former empire have uncovered dozens of public latrines, many remarkably intact. Stone benches, sewer channels, mosaics, graffiti, all preserved. We can walk through Ostia Antica and sit on the same benches Romans used 2,000 years ago. We can see the keyholes, trace the water flow, read the inscriptions. But the stories? Those survive only in fragments. A line in Juvenal, a complaint in a legal document, a reference in a letter. The violence, the chaos, the daily absurdity of latrine life, most of it is lost. We have the stage, but the play is gone.
And maybe that's fitting, because the toilet wars were never about the toilets. They were about people. Desperate, proud, petty, violent, human people, crammed into a city that was too big, too fast, too unequal to hold them without breaking. The latrines didn't create this. They just made it visible. Rome wanted to be remembered for its legions and laws, its roads and aqueducts, its emperors and poets. And it is. But it should also be remembered for its latrines, for the fights, the theft, the murders, for the urban cohorts patrolling bathrooms, for the graffiti insults and communal sponges, for the sheer, stupid, human mess of it all. Because that's the truth of Rome. It was glorious, it was sophisticated, it was brutal, it was petty. It conquered the world, and it couldn't control its toilets. Both are true. Both are Rome.